The International Monetary Fund has just slashed its global growth forecast for 2025 to 2.8%. Earlier, it was 3.3%. Now, the IMF is warning that the surge in tariffs and the specter of unpredictability that it brings is a recipe for global economic slowdown. And who's getting hit the hardest? No guesses for guessing that it's the United States itself, with the IMF's growth estimates now cut from 2.7% to just 1.8% for the United States. This is what we got from the IMF earlier today.
The increase in tariffs, especially since China is one of the countries that is facing the most elevated tariffs right now, is going to have a very significant impact in our projections on the Chinese economy. In fact, when we do a decomposition, which I showed during my opening remarks, the impact of the tariffs on the Chinese economy would be a negative 1.3 percentage point on a revision on growth. So why do we only have 0.6? Well, because there are other factors that are helping to support Chinese growth in 2025 and 2026, one of which is quite important, is the fiscal support that's been announced since the beginning of the year. And that is adding up something of the amount of 0.5 percentage point. So the impact of the current trade tensions is very significant. It's partly offset. We expect it to remain quite significant also in 2026.
So the trade tensions are leading to a slashing of global growth forecast by the IMF. In the middle of this American trade policy whiplash, the American Vice President, J.D. Vance, is in India, and he's got this message of optimism. There is a talk of partnership, a lot of admiration for the Prime Minister. He calls Modi a tough negotiator, and he says that's why we respect him. Very importantly, Vance wants greater access to Indian markets. He praises our tech ecosystem. He says the future of the Indo-Pacific, even the 21st century, hinges on a deeper alliance between the United States and India. He says India and the US have officially finalized the terms of the bilateral trade agreement that's become the cornerstone of this relationship. Listen to what we got from J.D. Vance, who's visiting India.
We have the capacity and we have the desire to help. Moreover, we think energy co-production will help beat unfair competitors in other foreign markets. But India, we believe, can go a long way to enhance energy ties between our nations. And one suggestion I'd have is maybe consider dropping some of the non-tariff barriers for American access to the Indian market. Now, I've talked about this, of course, with Prime Minister Modi. And look, President Trump and I know that Prime Minister Modi is a tough negotiator. He drives a hard bargain. It's one of the reasons why we respect him.
The Prime Minister drives a hard bargain, so says the American Vice President, J.D. Vance. So even as this optimism is meeting protectionism, cooperation is colliding with all this currency volatility right now as well, the question is, what can we expect for Indian exports, for global trade, and indeed for our portfolios as well? Let's discuss this with our expert panel tonight. Joining us, Dr. Richard Benkin. He's an American human rights activist, author, a close observer of American foreign policy. Joining him is Ambassador Ashok Sajjanhar, a seasoned diplomat, India's former envoy to multiple countries and a key voice on strategic affairs. And with them is Gaura Sengupta, chief economist at IDFC First Bank, with her finger, which is firmly placed on the pulse of macroeconomic shifts and India's growth story. Thank you all for joining us on India Tonight. Dr. Benkin, I want to ask you, we just heard the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, is calling this a win-win partnership between the US and India. But you tell us, how do we reconcile that kind of rhetoric with President Trump's economic nationalism, if I can call it that, and the IMF's warning about a global slowdown that is clearly getting induced by high tariffs?
Okay, I think we've already heard a statement to reconcile that. And that was from your own Prime Minister Narendra Modi when he visited the United States and said MAGA plus MEGA equals mega. That is, if the United States looks at what's best for the American people, if India looks at what's best for the people of India, there's pretty much nothing that can stop us. I want to focus on something else, though, that's extremely critical here. In his statement that without strong U.S.-India relations, the 21st century could be a dark time. This is the first time, and I've been a very close observer and a big fan of India and a guest in India so many times. This is the first time I can ever remember hearing such a strong statement of interdependence between a major Western power and India. And indeed, together we are critical in fighting evil. Just look to your east. We see China, whether it's oppression of the Uyghurs or how it is growing closer to your border through Bangladesh becoming much closer to India. And in fact, with that, their increased persecution of Hindus, we know we're fighting evil. And so it is critical. Now, going back to the economic, that's only possible because of the tremendous economic capacity of both countries. Look, I don't think there's a conflict between what President Trump is doing and what is best for world economies, especially those of the United States and India. It's a matter of just negotiating the right numbers, and you got great, bright people on both sides. They're going to do it. What's important is what this means within a geopolitical context, because as that U.S.-India relationship grows, the economic relationships that had existed between the U.S. and China start migrating not just back home to the United States, but as we are already seeing, they migrate to India and help generate more and more economic activity to the benefit of the people of India.
Ambassador, do you agree with what Mr. Benkin is saying over here? Because he says the interdependence comes from America and India's ability to fight evil, and then the economic kind of interdependence, if you can call it that, is going to follow. Are you convinced? J.D. Vance is saying that America wants access to the Indian market. He also says that Modi is a tough negotiator. So tell us what your reading is of India's current leverage in global trade negotiations, especially in this world with these new tariff walls. Ambassador.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Yeah, let me make a couple of points. One is that India has always maintained that the partnership with the United States is a very consequential one. You would recall that, many years ago, not yesterday, not today, many years ago, Prime Minister Modi in 2016, while addressing the joint session of the US Congress, he had said, the India-US partnership is an indispensable partnership. Now, those are strong words. And even during President Joe Biden's term, we have heard both President Biden as well as Kurt Campbell, his White House expert, senior officer. He said, this is the most important relationship for the United States in the 21st century. So I think it is good to hear from Vice President J.D. Vance that he says that it is a very, very important relationship. That having been said, we are also looking for a win-win partnership with the United States. But let me put it this way, that, one is at a bilateral level what we are trying to achieve. The other is in terms of the impact that President Trump's policies will have on the global economy. Because, it was said that the global economy otherwise would have risen, but as far as a result of President Trump's policies, both the global GDP as well as global trade is going to decline. Global trade would have increased by 2.7%. That's what the WTO says. But with Mr. Trump's policies, it is going to be minus 0.2. If that happens, it is not going to be good for India. It's not going to be good for the US. It's not going to be good for the world. Exactly. So I think we need to be mindful of that. Of course, as far as, there are different ways in which we have to approach this. Yes. We are, of course, negotiating with full integrity as far as the United States is concerned. We want to get a win-win solution. The three elements that Vice President J.D. Vance said, energy, technology, and defense. Yes. I think we are willing to work on that, but then the whole global environment has to improve. There's too much of uncertainty as a result of President Trump's policies.
So indeed, so that's exactly what we're trying to get at, that the interdependence and relying on each other for this kind of strategic partnership in the region, in the Indo-Pacific, remains crucial. But at this point in time, when you're talking about the economic fallout of higher tariffs, now that is the real key question. Of course, Vance is praising India's tech and startup ecosystem. But at the same time, he's talking about American companies wanting more access to Indian markets. Gaura, do come in on this. You think this could be a sticky point in these trade talks, even as the IMF is sharply cutting that global growth forecast now, and US is turning out to be the biggest downgrade by the IMF?
So thank you for having me. So basically, the IMF forecast, if you look at it, it's not really penciled in the worst case scenario. They're still not forecasting a recession in the US. I think they've put the recession probability at around 37%. So in terms of impact on growth, especially for India, we have to also take into account that post April 9th, when Trump announced the 90-day pause, he's also announced exemptions, for example, on semiconductors, smartphones. If you take the total list of exemptions, for example, from when the bilateral tariffs were announced, as well as subsequently, for India, around 30% of US imports from India are exempted. For other Asian countries, the proportion is even higher. For example, if you look at Taiwan, because the semiconductor, smart chip, heavy composition of its exports to US, more than 70% of US imports from Taiwan are now exempted from the bilateral tariffs. So some part of the impact is gradually getting reduced with these exemptions. So if, let's say, if you take the tariff of the 90-day, if that stays in place, where basically effectively apart from China, Canada and Mexico, every other country is at 10%, then the growth impact on a country like India will be lower. We estimate the growth impact could be as less as 20 basis points. If, let's say, the pause does not work and President Trump, post the pause, we go back to, let's say, 27% additional tariffs on India, then the growth impact can go up. It can go higher to maybe around 0.4 percentage points of GDP for India.
Yes.
So but the good part for us is we are still a domestic demand-driven economy, and these tariffs, as the other panelists have highlighted, are more harmful to the US. In our case, the good part is we are more dependent on our domestic growth as well as our investment cycles.
Yes.
But yes.
But those could get impacted as well, because you're talking about a global impact. And of course, investment cycles are a key as far as growth is concerned in India as well. If the world is moving towards safe haven assets like gold right now, can Indian investors look at the markets differently? And that remains a key question, because overall, if you're looking at a slowdown in the global economy, can India be spared? Mr. Benkin, as far as uncertainties are concerned, and Gaura actually put an if in most of the sentences that she's saying, this 90-day pause, if it goes well. In fact, as far as certain countries like Taiwan, she says, if that kind of continues, then the impact could be limited. But that's still a big if, and there are uncertainties. Then President Trump, he's clearly come out swinging, calling the Fed boss a major loser. I just want to ask you, is this just classic Trump bluster, or do you see serious political economic rifts within the US that could actually spook the markets further? Because some are talking about getting the Fed chair out.
First of all, with regard to things like the markets, as I always caution, everyone just needs to take a beat. You know, the market's up several hundred points in the United States again today. Markets go up, markets go down, predictions go one way, predictions go another. That's not what's important. They are taking snapshots of what's happening now. I think with regard to your question, it's a bit of both. Certainly, President Trump is very good at what you term bluster. It's certainly about being very powerful, being very, in fact, not pulling punches in what he says. By the same token, he's extremely transactional. He is going to do what's best for the people of the United States. That's what got him elected. That's what will keep his party in power. Just as the impacts that people are talking about, if you look again at that important geopolitical relationship and what it means and just how critical it is, certainly for the rest of this century, I would guarantee you the United States is not looking to do things that would harm India. They're looking to build up that relationship, and you only build it up by doing things that are positive for each other, not for one taking something at the other's expense. So as I said about the markets, same thing with all these talks about tariffs and trade negotiations. let's just wait. We are at the beginning of a process, not at the end of one. And I believe that once this is all negotiated, both countries are going to be very happy. And as I mentioned before, this is absolutely critical for the world in the coming decades and,
Sure.
and beyond. I think we saw a very good example of what we're facing in Kashmir earlier today. And I, along with so many Americans, are praying for the victims of that dastardly attack.
In fact,
we
I want
have to keep.
Absolutely. And indeed, we're watching the situation very closely. But Ambassador, how do you see this Vance visit, the kind of timing and the kind of attack that we are seeing reports of in Pahalgam? Do you think the idea is to make our region more secure? And in that sense, counter countries like China and Pakistan with India as a strategic ally? And if it is, then how much economic leeway would both countries give each other if that is truly, you believe that that's the common goal that they are angling for?
Let me make two very quick points there. Number one, we have been talking about this 90 days pause. My point is that even if the pause were to continue beyond the 90 days, there is a huge uncertainty that has come in. And I don't think any new, fresh investment has come into any country over the last several months and will not come in over the next several months also because of this uncertainty. Businessmen don't like uncertainty. They like predictability. They like certainty. That's number one. Number two, I think unfortunately, by the actions that President Trump has taken, in terms of the flip-flop that has taken place, the credibility and reliability of the United States has unfortunately got severely dented globally. We would like in India for America to be strong, for America to be powerful, for America to be respected and influential. But I think some of these actions have not really contributed to that. As far as, working together for making each other strong, I think what in India will need help from the outside in terms of intelligence, in terms of equipment, in terms of platforms that we have been getting. But otherwise, as far as our borders are concerned, frankly, that is our responsibility. We have been taking care of them, whether it is on the western border. If they come to us with Uri, we will give them a surgical strike. If they come to us with Pulwama, we'll give them a Balakot. And similarly on the northern borders, I think our neighbors and our adversaries have recognized that India is not a walkover power. That having been said, and that is why even as far as Indo-Pacific is concerned, I think India has a lot of contribution to make when the United States is looking that the Indo-Pacific should be free, should be open, should be inclusive, should be stable and prosperous. I don't think the United States can have a better partner than India to ensure that and to say that, there is going to be rule of law, because India is a resident power in this region, in the Indian Ocean, and also we have, also go to the expanse of the Western Pacific Ocean.
Ambassador, if I can ask you very plainly, which country, which economy needs the other more? Which economy benefits? If you're even talking about the India-US bilateral trade agreement, how do you see deepening? Who will benefit more?
I think it has to be a win-win, meaning it cannot be so very transactional. I have negotiated, I'll tell you, Vikram, many years at the WTO, at the GATT for these trade negotiations. And, you have to really look at the totality and of the outcomes. And here also, as we are looking at, it's not that one tariff line I give you, so I expect something in return on another tariff line. I think it's overall, and it used to be said during our negotiations, that a most successful negotiation is one in which both parties go back equally dissatisfied. Right. Because if, neither of them can be fully satisfied, because if one is fully satisfied, that means the other is not, hasn't received anything at all.
Not
So
anything,
both of
but
them,
maybe it might be lopsided, Ambassador.
no, not really, not really. I think what I mean is that if 50% of what I'm asking for, I'm able to get, and 50% of what the other side is asking for is it's able to get. So we are 50% satisfaction on both sides, and maybe 50% dissatisfaction. Otherwise, what you'll have is 100% satisfaction on the other side and a 0% satisfaction on one side. That is unsustainable. So I think it's when we are looking at a win-win situation,
Yes.
it is that both sides are getting their, as far as the red lines are concerned,
Yes.
they are respected. And as far as their core interests are concerned in terms of seeking access into the market of the other, I
Right.
think that also is taken, is also
But here at this point in
safeguarded.
time, yes, definitely. Let me take it across to the economist, Gaura. When JD Vance is talking about more access to the Indian markets at this point in time with the kind of demand situation that we have, and you say we are a demand-driven economy, and to that extent, we remain even a safe haven. In fact, I was talking to an analyst yesterday who looks at the markets and emerging markets very closely, and he believes that besides gold, an economy like India has a safe haven element right now inbuilt in it. But having said that, at this point in time, when an America is looking at greater access to the Indian market, are there risks involved in kind of, overheating our own economy and opening up the doors to inflation?
So, but as you yourself pointed out, that global growth can face a sort of a downward shock. When you have weaker global growth, chances of any economy overheating comes much lower. As one of your panelists also indicated, private corporate capex in this highly uncertain environment, it's going to be tentative. I mean, a company requires visibility that either domestic demand is strong or external demand is strong, and moreover, corporate profit growth has to be strong. None of these three conditions are currently being met. So we are not in any way, the conditions for an overheating economy are not there on the table. The risks are to the downside. Yes, we will end up giving greater access to get a sort of a bilateral deal to ensure that the tariff escalation, at least between India and the US, stay limited to merchandise and they don't fall into the services side, which
Yes.
is, if we are unable to meet a sort of an agreement, that could happen. That could be the next step for the escalation. But I don't see it as a risk for imported inflation, which was your question, because
Yes.
the component in our CPI for imported inflation is pretty low. 50% of our food basket, of our inflation basket is food.
Yes.
And we are a net exporter of food. So there is limited risk. And when you have tariff wars and other countries, especially China, is having difficulty in entering the US market, it will flood the rest of the world.
Right.
The risk to see on the currency front is whether China uses its currency as a tool against the US tariffs.
Right.
So that could be actively weakening its currency and exporting disinflation to the rest of the world. So again, the tariff situation, whatever is the deal that India strikes with the US, will be a downside risk to growth, will be a downside risk to inflation. A deal will definitely limit the risk, can keep the escalation contained towards merchandise, but it'll always be a downside risk, even for inflation, because most of our imported products from the US,
Yes.
they don't have a very large share in our consumption basket.
Right.
50% is still food.
Yes, like you said, 50% is food. But having said that, still, Gaura, I want to persist. The IMF is talking about a pause in corporate investments because of all this uncertainty, something the ambassador is also talking about. In fact, the finance minister has spoken about this too. She's spoken about how private investments can get derailed because of uncertainty. Do you see Indian firms already showing signs of caution, or do you think the domestic demand is still strong enough and it's going to keep Indian growth engines running?
So private corporate capex was on a sort of a cautious stage since last year itself. So last year, the issue that we had before, let's say, the tariff came to center stage, is that we had urban consumption on the weaker side. We've seen a slowdown in urban wage growth. So companies were already cautious. The thing that really helped us was the fact that the government of India, center as well as states, they increased capex. But some of that support reduced last year. The other support to the investment cycle was real estate post-COVID because of the build-up of household savings. Now, when you add the tariff uncertainty, private corporate capex will take its, I would say they would remain tentative because as such, domestically, at least the urban side of the equation in terms of demand was weaker.
Yes.
External side has got, we definitely expect merchandise export to be weaker. And what is interesting, while everybody touts India's services surplus with the US, our services exports, our software, the merchandise side of the trade is still much larger. Our merchandise exports to the US
Yes.
is double the services exports to the US because merchandise is a much older trade compared to services, which has come up more recently.
Yes. And that kind of balance is going to be an important piece when negotiations are done. But Dr. Benkin, in passing, now these tariffs are rising. Multilateral institutions are warning of a slowdown like the IMF. Could the United States really risk isolating itself? Or are we seeing this emergence of a new America and allies kind of trade bloc where India is part of it?
Yeah, I definitely would say the latter. Look, I've lived through enough times where I've heard people in the 1960s saying that by the 80s, the Soviet economy would overtake the U.S. economy. Didn't happen. I heard so many predictions over the last several years that the U.S. economy was in decline, that the Chinese economy would rule the world in the coming decades. And of course, none of those things happen. I also think you have to look at the bones of these economies. But beyond that, again, let's take a look at the strategic elements that are at play here because they're enormous and they're going to affect what these ultimate negotiations are. I mentioned the statement of interdependence between India and the United States that Vice President Vance made, and I was so thrilled by that. The other thing about his statement is, could we just look at if we just look at this as numbers and products, we're going to miss something. If I were in Moscow or Tehran, and I heard Vice President Vance talk about energy cooperation between India and the United States, I might soil myself. I'd be so upset. The fact is, if you take that as solely as an economic issue, then you're going to just focus on one thing. However,
yes,
look at how the United States, how India, and how allied nations benefit if, in fact, India and the United States work together that bring more energy from the United States or developed domestically in India versus importing it from Russia, importing it from Iran. And in fact, that has an impact on what Russia is going to do about negotiating an end to the Ukraine war. So there are tremendous geopolitical implications.
Indeed.
And I think in addition to looking at the economics, we must recognize that different products have different geopolitical impacts.
Well, there's no taking away from the fact that tonight we're seeing the world at the crossroads. On one side, there is the promise of a deeper India-US partnership, which is built on tech, which is built on trust and trade. And on the other end, you see the storm clouds of tariffs, uncertainty as well, and all this economic nationalism and the rhetoric around it. The IMF, of course, has rung the alarm bell. Global growth is slowing, and the US, surprisingly, is leading the slide. Yet India stands at an inflection point with opportunity knocking. But at the same time, there is risk lurking as well. But thank you to our fantastic panel, Dr. Richard Benkin, Ambassador Ashok Sajjanhar, and Gaura Sengupta. Thank you for helping us decode the rhetoric and the risks and the real politic as well. Thanks indeed for joining us on India Tonight. Let's see how